welcome to Across the Fence. I'm Jolene Whitney. Of all the forces that shape the Earth, from volcanoes and earthquakes to weather and water, the effects of animals can be often overlooked. As creatures great and small move across the face of the planet, they live, die, eat, and yes, poop. The impact of the life cycle of animals often goes unmentioned, and maybe that's because wild animals are a disappearing and dying breed. Eat, Poop, and Die, How Animals Make Our World by Joe Roman was named a top 10 best book of 2023 by Scientific American. To talk eating, pooping, and dying, I'm joined by Joe Roman. Besides devising tricky book titles to say on TV, Joe is a conservation biologist and a fellow at the Gund Institute for the Environment at UVM. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Jolene. I'm glad to be here.
Before we jump into a little bit about what the book is about, let's maybe start with the obvious. How did you choose a title like this?
So I was on a Fulbright in Iceland a few years ago, and as today, I got up super early in the morning, and that's what I do, and I worked on my talk, and I was putting together a slide, and it was about how humpbacks eat krill in that area, and then they poop, and they move nutrients around, and then they often travel long distances where they die. And it occurred to me right there on the title slide, I said, Eat, Poop, Die, and that should be the title of my next book. So I've stuck with it, even if there's been some discussion about whether that title is going to fly or not, we're sticking with it.
And so you're talking a little bit about how you came up with the idea, but how did a run-in with, it was about 20 years ago, I believe, a run-in with a large plume of whale dung, how did that kind of shape your idea of how the animal life cycle impacts the environment?
Sure. So I worked for the New England Aquarium studying a highly endangered whale, the North Atlantic right whale. There are only about 300 on the planet. And what we were doing is trying to see how many whales were in the Bay of Fundy at a particular time and whether they were pregnant females or they were with calves or males. And the first whale I ever saw was a large male. It rose right in front of us, enormous breath. It had some mud on its bonnet because it was diving deep to feed. And then just before it fluked, it raised its tail, it put out this enormous fecal plume about the size of the boat. I didn't know it then, but that was going to shape much of my career. There aren't, as I mentioned, there aren't that many whales, but you spend a lot of times on boats, you start thinking about what the oceans would have been like when there were tens of thousands of whales.
And so you coined the term whale pump. Can you explain a little bit about what that is?
Sure. So at that point, I saw this fecal plume, and what we would collect it, and we were looking at what they ate. And also you can look at hormones. So are they pregnant? Are they stressed? And a couple of years later, I was taking a class, and we learned about this biological pump, and that's a really big process in the ocean. You only have photosynthesis at the surface of the ocean where there's light, right? And then you have krill and fish and other organisms eating the phytoplankton that's creating all this food, and it sinks, right? So the feces or the dead bodies sink to the bottom. But it occurred to me while I was sitting in that class that whales do the opposite. I thought back to that first day. Whales dive deep to feed. Sometimes they have mud on their heads. They come to the surface and they release all those nutrients up at the surface. Why does this matter? Because during the summertime, the hot, warm water floats to the surface. It's lighter, and the cold water with lots of nutrients is at the bottom. So the nutrients run out. The whales are taking those nutrients up and sort of fertilizing their gardens. So we put this idea forward in a model, and one of the responses was, well, sure, there's some nutrients in these fecal plumes. There's nitrogen, there's iron, just like we would put in our gardens. But is it ecologically important or a fart in a hurricane? And that's what we've been looking at. We've been showing through a lot of effort, collecting feces from around the world, looking at the nitrogen, and then adding it all up, and we find that it's very ecologically important, and in fact, it can change productivity in the summertime when those nutrients run out. Just like we use manure in our gardens, the whales are, whether it's intentional or not, providing manure in those surfaces and changing the productivity in the summertime. And that matters to the fish, that matters to the krill, that matters to the whales themselves, because that's when they're feeding and that's when the nutrients can run out.
And you talked a little bit about the cycle going from high levels to lower levels. How different of an environment is like the higher level of the ocean versus the bottom?
Sure. So it makes a big difference in the summer. So the surface of the water is heated up by the sun. There isn't as much wind as there in the winter. And of course, all the phytoplankton's there, and they're going crazy because they're at the surface. It's warm. There's lots of sun. But the problem is they use up all those nutrients after a while, and all the nutrients, as I mentioned, that biological pump are dropping below the surface, right? So cold waters, warm waters at the surface, and the whales are going back and forth, and they're breaking down that barrier and bringing those nutrients up to the surface.
Okay, and you talked about being closer to the surface. What's the significance of when a whale dies and sinks to the bottom?
Yeah, so a lot of the work that I do is looking at this movement up to the surface. But of course, when whales die, especially in the deep sea, their carcasses drop down, right? And they can drop thousands of feet, even tens of thousands of feet to the bottom of the ocean. We were talking about nutrients that were found sort of right beneath that surface layer. But in the really deep sea, it's like a desert. Very little bit of that biological pump comes down, those little nutrients. But when a whale dies, we don't have trees in the ocean, but we do have the largest animals that have ever lived on the planet. Blue whales, for example, fin whales. And when they die, there's an enormous pulse of energy and nitrogen and all these important nutrients that are falling into the deep sea. And amazingly, this has been occurring for millions of years. There are now at least, we know of more than 100 species that are dead whale specialists. They only can survive on these like deep sea islands. And the whales bring nutrients to those areas that would take usually about 1,000 years in those tiny little particles. So you have worms, you have clams, you have crabs, and you also have sharks and other species that are coming to this area. And they've depended on these whale falls for thousands of years, for millions of years. One concern is because of extensive commercial whaling, is we took that habitat out when we removed the whales, and we might have caused some of the first extinctions in the deep sea by taking those whale fall habitats out of the ocean. The good news is that in the past 50 years, we've changed our course, and a lot of whale populations are rebounding. So we're hoping we can prevent any more extinctions in the deep sea in these whale fall communities.
Yeah, keep those deep sea organisms fed.
They're important and they're fascinating. I mean, one organism's called Osedax, or bone eater. It doesn't actually eat. Doesn't have a mouth, it doesn't have a gut, it doesn't have an anus. It has a root system, and it basically supplies sulfides to the bacteria that are in what's like its gut, and they supply all the food for these worms, even though they're never eating. They don't even have a mouth, but they're just having internal organisms that are supplying there. And that, of course, can only happen on the large bones of whales.
Absolutely. So to go from very deep in the ocean to the sky. Of course, seabirds are, as we've learned to call them on this show, pelagic birds. Okay. They're also incredibly important to environments and ecosystems. Can you tell me a little bit about their role?
Yeah, so I start the book with seabirds off this island, an island off of Iceland called Surtsey, which only emerged in the 1960s. So it's only been around, just had its 60th birthday 2 months ago. And what's incredible about this system is the biologists have been following it since day one. No life, hot lava, and they're watching what happens, how life forms on a barren rock, right? And there were just a few ocean-borne plants surviving there and a couple of insects, but then birds started arriving. Gulls, fulmars, other pelagic birds would come land in that area. They nested, and they were also dropping poop. Every day, 3 ounces of poop. And that adds up, especially when you have hundreds of birds. So now, in that area, you have this dense grasslands that are formed because of these seabirds. Anywhere the birds are not found, there's just a few plants. Where the birds are, you have this rich, carbon-rich environment that have attracted insects, that have attracted new plants. So it's birds that are really changing this system. And this isn't that new. I mean, the word guano comes from the Quechua language. From thousands of years ago, the Inca have known that seabird dung, seabird guano, was important to life on these islands, and they also excavated it and brought it into their gardens. So I think of seabirds really as the ambassadors for this idea behind eat, poop, die, and the technical term is zoogeochemistry, or how animals affect the chemistry of the planet. Seabirds really are the best way to see that, because probably everyone has seen a gull poop in front of them, right? And you can just go out and walk and find a little bit of gut dung. You might find that annoying at first, but think about how that can help create ecosystems everywhere, not only on oceanic islands, but also on the coastlines, and even birds that are coming here off Lake Champlain.
And a lot of your work has been dedicated to talking about animal extinctions, and we even earlier talked about deep sea animals going extinct because of whale carcasses. Are we in a mass extinction now?
Sadly, we are. It's been called the sixth extinction, so it's the sixth mass extinction event on the planet Earth, the first one that we know that's caused by one species, that is us, humans, right? Some estimates put the extinction rate at 1,000 times higher than it was on average, so that's what humans are doing. They're accelerating this extinction rate. And just in our lifetimes, we've lost probably hundreds of species, or in the past 100 years, passenger pigeons, or lots of small deep sea organisms as well as many birds on Hawaii. So that's the sad news, is that we're in the middle of that extinction event right now.
So are laws and acts to combat that extinction, are they working?
That's what I've been doing for the past couple of decades, and I'm happy to say, having grown up on the East Coast, particularly in New York, when I was growing up in New York City, I never saw a whale, I never saw a seal. Birds weren't that common. Fish striped bass populations were down, and now, because of some incredible laws, which include the Marine Mammal Protection Act, we can't kill marine mammals, the Endangered Species Act, which protects rare species, as well as the Clean Water Act, and efforts to protect fish species. Whales are back. I see humpback whales, I see fin whales off the coast. The waters are cleaner, birds are back, fish populations have increased. So these laws are incredibly effective. So are the personal things we can do in our own backyard, or we can do by joining nonprofits. But these laws make a huge difference. Even here in Vermont, 50 years ago, you wouldn't have seen bald eagles, you wouldn't have seen peregrine falcons. There are two species that were on the Endangered Species Act that are back and are finally nesting in this area. So that's thanks to laws as well as actions that local communities and local people do.
Absolutely, a bit of a silver lining to wrap up our show today.
And I hope, that's the dream of the book, is to push that in that direction and to convince people that they can make a difference in their own home, and that animals are more than just something that's cute. They bring us joy and they bring us wonder, but they can also really change the way we view the planet.
That's incredible. Thank you so much for joining me today, Joe.
Thank you, Jolie.
Eat, Poop, Die: How Animals Make Our World is available wherever you get your books. We, of course, encourage you to visit your local library, where I'm sure a librarian would be happy to suggest you other books that Joe has written with less scatological titles. That wraps up our visit across the fence for today. I'm Jolie Whitney. Have a good one.